Zdarsky, the mystical green beanie.
Hey, what's going on, dudes and dudettes? I am the mystical green beanie, and even though April is coming to an end, and I continue to procrastinate my Spider-Man movie retrospective on Spider-Man 3, because that would mean I have to sit through, think about, then write about Spider-Man 3, I'm gonna make time to talk about other Spider-Man stuff. Namely, the second issue of Spider-Man Life Story by Chip Zdarsky, Mark Bagley, Andrew Hennessy, and Frank D'Armata. So, the shtick this book is running with is that it's going to be following the life of Peter Parker in real time, and each issue will skip ahead a decade. And since the last issue took place in 1967, when Peter was in college, this issue takes place in 1977. So, let's get into it. And I want to lead off by saying that this is probably one of the best examples of a modern what-if story, or at the very least, it's one of my favorite. Because Chip Zdarsky and Mark Bagley are adhering to the traditional narrative staples of Spider-Man, but everything is turned on its ear, and this very much feels like a cinematic representation of the life of Peter Parker. You know, like we're watching a Spider-Man biopic, but in comic form. And I'm pretty sure that's what they're going for, and they're doing a damn fine job of it. So this issue picks up with Peter Parker monologuing in front of a tombstone, catching the readers up on the events that have taken place between the last issue and this issue, and he's talking about what happened with Harry after his father was arrested, and how Gwen is now working for her creepy college professor who has a crush on her. And as it turns out, this isn't Uncle Ben's grave like it usually is when Peter's wallowing in guilt in a graveyard. It's Flash Thompson's, you know, who apparently died after he was shipped off to fight in the Vietnam War. And there's something really interesting about Flash's death, but I'll talk about that a little more in detail later. Anyways, Peter is now working for Reed Richards, who is now no longer a member of the Fantastic Four, but instead just another super scientist who owns a think tank, which he calls the Future Foundation, which I think is a cool way to incorporate the Future Foundation concept into this universe. And speaking of which, Doc Ock is also working for the Future Foundation, which I think is a reference to an old John Byrne Fantastic Four story where Sue has radiation poisoning and Reed needs Otto's help, and I guess in this universe, Otto never went back to being evil because there was no editorial mandate to return his character back to status quo. But moving on, Harry visits his father in prison, and Norman tells him that Peter is Spider-Man, and that he should carry on the Goblin legacy, and he gets this really cool obsidian goblin costume, and I just fell in love with that design almost instantly. But I'll talk more about the costumes in just a bit. And we also see MJ in this book, and I gotta say, this is the most MJ has been since MJ, well, even before JMS. And I love JMS, but his run is weird, because he's writing those characters, but it's like he's writing them with a slight JMS twist. You know, whereas here, you know, Zdarsky is just writing MJ as classic comic book MJ, and I really like that. In fact, he does that with all the characters, and that's something that I really appreciate as a Spider-Man fanboy. But there's a great scene with MJ where she's drunk and she just goes off on him, revealing that she's always known that Peter was Spider-Man, which again is another cool twist on what actually happens in the 616 comics. But here she's violently lashing out at him because she knows that Peter is Spider-Man, and he chose not to go to war, yet their friend Flash Thompson did, and now he's dead. And it's interesting that Zdarsky does this with MJ and not Gwen, because that last issue kind of felt like a setup for this altercation to happen with Gwen, but I like that it happens with MJ a lot more as I'm reading it and thinking about it. And there's also a little bit of the Clone Saga in here as well. Chip Zdarsky sows the seeds for the Clone Saga by homaging the original Clone Saga from the 70s, where Miles Warren clones Gwen Stacy because he wanted to have a Gwen all to himself. And what do you know? It's just as creepy here as it was in the 70s. Who would have thunk it? And we also get to see a version of the death of Gwen Stacy play out here as well. not only with Gwen's death, but in the way Peter reacts to Gwen's death, and how he freaks out at MJ, only for her to stay by his side. And once again, Zdarsky and Bagley are hitting the same beats, but with different context. But the motivations, actions, and interactions between all these characters feels genuine, and not like they're copying the homework of what came before. Which is why I really feel like Zdarsky just gets these characters and gets Spider-Man. But outside of Spider-Man, I wanted to talk about some of the greater Marvel Universe stuff, which we don't get a lot of, but what we do get is really interesting. So starting off with the Vietnam War, which is still going on apparently, I find it fascinating that Flash Thompson dies in 1974, presumably KIA, because that's a year after the Vietnam War ended in the real world. In fact, it's still going on as this issue picks up, and it's been dragging out because of Captain America going rogue, which then started a superhero civil war in Vietnam. And there's a lot of really interesting ethical debate between Peter and Reed Richards as to how the superhero community at large should react. And speaking of which, let's talk about Reed Richards, because, bruh, it's tragic. But it totally makes sense for the Fantastic Four and Reed Richards, because we find out that Sue Storm left him for Namor. Because, I don't know, I guess she just got fed up with his emotional and psychological abuse. But either way, Peter calls him out for it, and he gets fired on the spot. And while I'm grateful for this series, the way Zdarsky handles the characters in this world, I really want to see his initial pitch for this book, where he just shows us this Marvel Universe. Because now, I do want to see what the Fantastic Four, and the Avengers, and the X-Men, and Daredevil, and the Hulk, and the Heroes for Hire, and Luke Cage, and Jessica Jones look like in the Zdarsky-verse? Oh, and one last thing before I move on to the art. The scene with Gwen felt very much like an homage to the 90s Spider-Man cartoon, where Peter realizes that the MJ that he's been married to was a clone. And I'm not sure if that was intentional or not, but I'd like to think it is. But if anyone is curious, I think you just have to ask the man on Twitter or Instagram or whatever. As for the art, it's still amazing. And like I said earlier, there's a cinematic quality to the art that I'm just not quite used to seeing with Bagley's pencils. And that's all down to Hennessy and Diarmada. And again, to draw a comparison between Ultimate Spider-Man and this, Ultimate Spider-Man feels very much like you're reading a comic book that's set in the not-too-distant future. But here, the art makes you feel like you're watching a cinematic biopic, because the colors are somewhat muted, but also really dramatic, if that makes any sense at all. I hope it does, because I'm far from being an expert on film and photography. But I also really liked the redesigns of certain characters in this issue. As I already mentioned, the Obsidian Goblin is amazing. I'm not sure if that's his name or not, but that's what I'm going to call him until someone who's worked on the book tells me otherwise, which I'm sure won't ever happen. So, yeah, here we are. But there's a uniqueness to it that fundamentally cements itself as Harry's costume, which I think is an interesting choice. But as much as I love the Obsidian Goblin, that Spider-Man redesign is beautiful. Because here's the thing. Peter Parker is 30 in this issue, right? And he's working for Reed Richards, right? So it just makes sense that he'd upgrade his suit. And it looks like a weird amalgamation of the PS4 costume and, appropriately enough, the 1970s live-action TV show Spider-Man costume. And this is something that you can only get away with in a book like this, where it is in its own self-contained universe. And I like that Zdarsky and Bagley get to play with the Spider-Man costume like that. All in all, this second issue really set the stage for not only a bold new miniseries, which could end up being for Spider-Man what All-Star Superman is to Superman, but a bold new Marvel universe. And look, I don't mean to suck Chip Zdarsky's dick, but between Spectacular Spider-Man, Marvel 2-in-1, his run on Daredevil currently. In this, it's kind of hard not to. And that sounded weird. See, this is what happens when I go off script. That's why I don't go off script. I say weird things when I go off script. Anyways, what are your thoughts on this series? Are you loving it as much as I am currently? Are you, like, not enjoying it? Whatever your current position, let me know down below in the comment section. Also, if you like this video, hit the like button, share, support the channel, and if you want to see more content like this, all you have to do is subscribe. I'm the Mystical Green Beanie. Thanks for watching, and as always, until next time, adios nachos, adios.